Hello and good morning, everyone. This is Jay from ChainSafe Gaming, and we're back here with another episode discussing innovative ideas with innovative studios and infrastructure providers. If you're unfamiliar with ChainSafe, we're a research and development firm focused on Web3 full stack development. We help build protocols, write smart contract standards, consult, audit, and do custom development. We have an awesome show today with Playmint. We'll be talking to David and Ian, the CEO and the CTO. They're doing something extremely innovative in our space, redefining what decentralization means. And with that said, I'd love to bring them onto stage along with our very own Martin. Hello and good morning, everyone. Give me 1 second. My screen's a bit delayed. Come on. Hey, sorry about that.
Right.
Looks like my panel's a bit delayed for whatever reason, so I'll bring you on one by one as it loads. Hey, David.
Hey, here's everybody. Thanks, Jay. Thanks for the intro. Nice to be here.
Hi, Jay. Nice to meet you. Good to be here.
Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks to have you all on stage and for coming on today. So if you can, for a second, David, Ian, can you give a brief intro of yourselves and of Playmint?
Sure, I'll start then. So yeah, David Amor, I'm the CEO of Playmint. My background is in the traditional games industry, so many years across, PlayStation and Xbox and Nintendo and PC and mobile. And for the last 3 years, we've been running Playmint that asks itself what new kind of games you can build with decentralized technologies.
Awesome. And Ian?
Yeah, I am Ian. I'm also traditional games industry for about 25 years. Broad spectrum of large to small studios, running my own mobile game companies to working for big studios like Disney and Warner. And yeah, working with David here at Playmint on cool decentralized stuff for games.
Awesome. You both have great experiences, so it makes a lot of sense that you're innovating in our space. And we have our very own Martin. For those who aren't familiar with you, Martin, can you give a brief intro?
Yes, certainly. I'm Martin. I'm with ChainSafe Gaming, working with a Web3 Unity team. We provide a SDK that makes it easy for people to add basic Web3 functionality to your game, like transaction logic. It's all open source. We're currently at version 3.06, something like that. So there has just been a major update. If you want to come check it out or contribute, you're more than welcome. And because I'm working with Web3 technologies in gaming, I have quite an interest in autonomous worlds and fully on-chain games as well. This is how I met David, or how I learned about Playmint. And yeah, I'm happy to be here today and have a discussion about what can be done to potentially not overuse blockchain technology in gaming.
Do you know what? One of the things I like about Martin is that you have the curiosity to seek out new ideas that have been tried out. Like ahead of other people, you both found out what we were doing before we release anything, and then you understood it probably ahead of anybody else. So I appreciate that you and ChainSafe have an appetite for thinking about things in a new way. It's appreciated.
Yeah, we're definitely experimenting a lot. And it was great to meet you in Bangkok. Thank you for coming up to me. We were just kind of at your event, actually, that you were hosting.
Mhm.
And you saw the ChainSafe logo. You came up to me and you're like, "Where's Martin?" So that was a really fun, cool experience. And it was great to learn about Playmint and everything you were working on. So
Well, yeah, more than that, I think sometimes I get a little disillusioned with people's love of blockchain. Sometimes I think that gets in the way of finding out the right technical approach. And I think blockchain solves a lot of problems, but I think it introduces another set, some technical, some cultural, and meeting people that are willing to think about things in a different way is always welcome. So yeah, nice to be here.
yeah, it was definitely fun to meet you and to learn about Playmint. I'd love for us to get into that. And what is a player chain? I know you were explaining it to me. It took me a little bit to wrap my head around it. So I'd love to share with the audience, what is a player chain?
And from me, you'll get the non-technical answer or not very technical answer. And if you want to get into the weeds, Ian is better equipped to answer that. I guess by way of a story, we released a fully on-chain game, or at least a primitive version of a fully on-chain game in the summer of this year. And by that, I mean a game that runs completely on a blockchain. It ran on a layer 2 of Ethereum. And when we released it, one of the problems we felt, or shortcomings, was that by running on a public blockchain, you're somewhat limited by block time. So you're seeing an update every 2 seconds, and you're somewhat limited by the fact that you have to pay gas whenever you want to do anything. And if you're running a game completely on chain, that ends up being slow and expensive. And so what we liked about a public blockchain is it was truly decentralized and allowed a new set of attributes within the game, but it really caused a new bunch of issues. It's slow and expensive. And so we asked ourselves if there was a different approach that we could take to fix those issues. And it's actually an idea that we've had bubbling around for years and felt it was a good opportunity to try it. And the idea of a player chain is, simply put, rather than using a public blockchain to run that computation, Instead of those public blockchain as a set of nodes that you as a player use, instead we say, why don't we let anybody playing the game become a node? And you effectively create a blockchain between the players. So it has 2 advantages, I guess. One is that by creating this blockchain between, imagine 50 people playing a game of Minecraft, rather than using a server and using a server authoritative model, instead use a consensus between the 100 people playing it. That has the advantage of that it's fast, because you're just sending transactions between players. You're not having to have consensus on a blockchain. And it's free because there are no gas fees in that system. So I guess simply put, player chains is the idea of using a peer-to-peer system, a consensus-driven peer-to-peer system, to operate rather than a public blockchain. How did I do, Ian? You got anything to correct me on there or add to?
That's all very good and accurate. We can go into more details of any of that, whatever's interesting, but it usually leads to more questions when you first hear that idea of the players are the chain.
Yeah, so that led a lot of questions for me. But Martin, I would love to hear your thoughts on hearing this idea, what it sparked, and what were your thoughts around there?
Yeah, when I first heard about it, I looked at it from a systems engineering perspective, pretty much. Because if you have a blockchain, you know that you're buying into pretty much a single-threaded, super slow system, which is a pity, because if you always need to wait for stuff to happen, or end up in a scenario where the main thread could be like throttled, blocked, whatever, then you can't possibly run a game that has a great user experience, or at least a user experience that is on the same level of nowadays games that we play and love. So looking at it, the first time I thought, hey, this is a smart idea to rip it apart and have computation happening between the peers that need it. And then somehow, back then I didn't fully get how it was built, but I thought it was nice to make sure that people only agree on what they need in their little group, and not on the entire global state of a database of transactions, if you want. And I always thought putting games on chain is a bit overkill. When I first saw that, I thought those autonomous worlds frameworks, they're trying to do a very interesting thing, but the only way out to ever get this feasible would be to tremendously increase the throughput of any given system. And we see how this can be done. I don't know, layer 3s, layer 4s, domain-specific rollups. It all turns into a big infrastructure battle that can be frustrating. And this is why I thought, hey, if people come up with modern networking frameworks and they try to solve it within the networking layer somehow, this is interesting enough for me to dig. And as always in blockchain, there's challenges that can't be ignored. Still, with Playmint, I had the feeling that they want to try something that could actually solve a bigger problem that has turned into, it's not regarded a problem anymore, using blockchains for stuff that they're not intended to be used for. It's more like a accepted flaw that people just need to work around. And this is something that shouldn't happen in gaming, because this is the area of IT that I care about most, or with my heart pretty much, because I love games. And if it can be done on a blockchain, then the current systems might actually need a conceptual upgrade. And I hope for Playerchains to become that conceptual upgrade that takes away the accepted set of problems that we buy into if we want to try to put games on chain.
I think that blockchain is really useful for a bunch of things. I think as a company, we realize it's not the right tool for everything. So I think Playerchains still creates or connects to a blockchain in some way. And I think, could see it for payment systems or ID. There's plenty of things that I think it's still useful for, but that moment-to-moment gameplay, I think it's in most cases unnecessary. Sometimes it depends somewhat on the game that you're making. If you're making a game that is heavily built around an economy, and you're building a game that is more turn-based or slower, then maybe doing it fully on chain is the right approach. I think we would make the case that for the majority of games, it's not the correct approach for decentralizations. It has too many shortcomings, and nor is server authoritative. I don't want to go back to that as a company, but I guess in Playerchains that's a third option, and to us it seems to solve some problems that we saw in building fully on-chain games for the last 3 years.
Well, it's certainly true. It's like right tools for the right game, but we imagined the kind of game that was most difficult to do for fully on-chain games. So a game which was required instant, real-time multiplayer for the experience to work. So we've made that possible with a decentralized solution. But then with that in place, you can then mix and match what's the right technology for the right game.
It's super interesting, Martin. You mentioned a bit earlier that we just kind of accepted these flaws. And I was thinking about a lesson I was giving yesterday about teaching Web3 game development, and how I was telling them this exact thing that you went through, in where like it depends on your game, or what mechanics you have, if it's turn-based, if it's delayed. And we're kind of designing the game mechanics around the limitations of the blockchain. But then we're all looking at each other like this isn't the greatest experience, and we all know it, but we just kind of accepted it. So it's interesting where we're at right now. And I'd like to get into a bit more details about the trade-offs it comes to having their own blockchains. So for me, one of the questions I had immediately is like, is there a way, if we have this game, we have the shared chain for this one, let's say game mode, how can I access that game mode afterwards, or that data that came out of that game mode, if I want to do something like maybe a leaderboard for the entire game or something like that? How does that all work, and what are the trade-offs there?
I think I've got two answers for that. One is an obvious one. One is maybe more innovative. The simple one is that because a player chain is deterministic, provable environment, then that high score that occurs in a player chain can be written back to a blockchain. So you can imagine it's a bit like a state channel, I suppose, in some senses, where we all agree that this is what happens. You can prove it, and you can reliably put that high score back to a layer 2 blockchain. I think that's an obvious way that you can do that. There's another idea that we haven't implemented yet, but I think is interesting, which is as people that are running player chains connect up with the other player chains, they share what's happened that they've seen in the world. So if you can imagine that it's almost like a lazy distribution of information. So as player chains connect up with other player chains, they're sharing what they've seen, and they can say, oh, Jay got a high score. But that means you might not see it immediately, but over time, then as player chains connect with other player chains, then that global state gets built. Ian, do you want to have a better run at explaining the lattice system that I described there?
That's great. I think that's what it is. It is like a lazy dissemination of what each player and each group has experienced. So you have this emergent global state. And in terms of trade-offs, what you're trading off there against working on a global public blockchain is that you don't have like instant access to the current state everywhere in the world, because and that's kind of useful for some things like deciding who owns what and how much money they've got in this decentralized system. You kind of need that global instant state, but that comes at the cost of that whole computer being random mutex. It's like only one person at a time can adjust that thing. Hence, you have the inherent latency and costs of running on those public blockchains. So whilst in the player chain emergent lattice of player chains, you're trading off a single global state. That global state is still there, but it's more emergent and it's more relevant. So the bits that you care about are the bits that you've engaged with, and what you get instead is the ability to run things super fast and for free.
And I guess maybe useful to talk about something that I've seen in the experience in traditional games industry. Let's imagine a game like Grand Theft Auto, which has lots of people, of course, moving around in a world. If I'm in one part of the map and there's another, I'm not actually worried about what's happening on the other side of the map until I get to the other side of the map. Of course, it becomes very important when we meet, but it's not really relevant until we get there. Or maybe there's some attribute that is, but I think that it's inefficient and unnecessary to keep a state of everything that's going on the map and sharing it with the player, because it just doesn't need to know most of the time. So why don't we have a system where the player finds out about the stuff that they need to know about at the time that they need to know about it? And that's, I guess that's the fundamental architecture for the lattice version of player chains.
So I love this idea because it helps me segment information into different buckets, right? We have our L1s where we're kind of batching transactions, settling there. We have the L2s where now in your case, you're kind of taking specific games, their experiences, and then only taking the relevant information and publishing it to L2s. So it's interesting how we're digging further and further and segmenting information to these buckets where they're necessary. So it's more interesting the more we talk about it and I wrap my head around this. It just makes sense in a lot of ways. So it's great that we're having this conversation.
Well, I suppose just at a very simple level, as Ethereum and its L2s get bigger, at some point it just can't accommodate everything that's going on, and so you have to find some solution for sharding it, or not even sharding, but just find some way, a more efficient way of scaling something like that. So we think for games that a lattice version of player chains is a good approach.
Maybe one more thing that might be interesting what you said, Jay. There's only part of the information that you're interested in, which is oftentimes 95% of all the information that is available at any given point in time to yourself as a player. And when it comes to the fundamental basic things, call it physics, call it whatever, those could be on a persistent ledger, and it would be like global rules. And this nicely blends into this lazy evaluation functional composition thing, which is inherently what's happening there. So I think it's a much more elegant solution if you get it to work. It's a bit like if you want to write code and you turn to something like, I don't know, Common Lisp or Haskell or something like that. You know already that you need to think about this deeply, and you really need to worry about all the possible outcomes at the start. But in the end, it will give you a much more robust system that you can use for almost anything. It's much more flexible. It might not be faster per se, but because something like EVM cannot properly be parallelized, it's a lot faster than what you would be getting if you bought into a regular blockchain system with a structure that is inherently single-threaded. So I think there's a lot of room for taking better design decisions, and I think it's a good time to start doing it, because we've seen it the last couple of years. Everybody was building whatever they thought would be necessary to get the blockchain or Web3 ecosystem running at all. Mainly focused on DeFi, then maybe a bit focused on NFTs, and a lot of infra on the way. Now we're at a point of productivity where specific solutions for the problem that we're like trying to solve here, making blockchains reasonable backends for games that scale infinitely. It's a good time to really have those conversations and build more focused and not so much in the realm of getting things to work at all. And this is what excites me about doing this right now, because somebody has to find those solutions, even though it's probably pretty hard. If you do it on a daily basis, it's probably a pretty hefty endeavor.
Now, I feel like everyone has mentioned the difference, since we're segmenting information, settling it differently, about the speed. So let's get into the speed. What is the major difference within speed from your game versus from your Playerchains versus like an EVM chain or something like that?
Yeah, I think so we're kind of limited to a 2-second block time on Ethereum, or at least the layer 2s on Ethereum that we've operated on. You can turn that, you can make a faster block time, which we see some blockchains doing, but often they're introducing centralization, and there's probably a limit that you can do. Just architecturally, it's going to force some amount of centralization as you reduce that block time. And still, we're used to building video games that have like a 50 millisecond transaction times in traditional game space, and here we are talking about 2000 milliseconds as being fast for a blockchain layer 2. I think if I can try and bring it up, I'm going to show a demo of something that we created. Prove that Playerchains works at speed, and you can see this is not a typical on-chain game experience. You have a set of players playing a sort of space shooting game, and I think we locked it in at 100 milliseconds, but we can probably go a little bit faster depending on network conditions. I guess importantly, we're at network latency. We're not at any sort of forced consensus system at that point. So that's a game that we built deliberately to stress test the speed of Playerchains. And you can see that's a sort of in contrast to the fully on-chain games that we've made in the past, which have much more latency. So that's something we built, and that's what latency looks like on a player chain currently.
Yeah, so when you showed me that demo in person, I was kind of amazed too. If you're watching this in the audience and you didn't catch it, while the game was being played, you can see on the right-hand side all the transactions that are happening between each of the player chains, right?
Yeah, that's right. That shows the block lace being formed. So each player, I don't have it on the screen, but each player is a column in that block lace, and as it's speaking to other people that are playing the game, then it creates this block lace, which is a type of DAG consensus that's built over time. So has maybe a foot in decentralized network code and a foot in blockchain. Have you got something to add to that, Ian?
And the fundamental latency win is that the consensus isn't an algorithm that happens on a separate set of nodes that need to agree on the order of transactions that happen before running that transaction and passing the state back to the users of a blockchain, because that each player is forming their own blockchain on their own computer and passing on their latest transactions for all of the others to come to consensus over. That we're using a kind of DAG consensus, which enables that to happen. The consensus is not instant, but all the transactions are accepted instantly, and then there's a small window of time where it could be rolled back if it's decided that amongst the group that the order wasn't quite right, or someone was sending something that was too late, or the wrong kind of input. But essentially, when everyone's behaving themselves, it can be instantly accepted, and therefore the latency time comes down to just the network speed, so the speed of light across the network. If you're close to each other, like in the same continent, you can have 30 millisecond transaction times. And the reason we're as much as 100 milliseconds in that demo was to give us a bit of a buffer to demonstrate the game in any circumstances at the moment.
So you mentioned something pretty interesting there, which is if we're actively comparing every single movement, let's say that's happening within the game, within our player chains, then in some sort of way it functions as an anti-cheat, right? Because I can see you are claiming you made a move. The rest of our computers within this system are saying, no, you went over here. So if you're trying to cheat locally, our chains will pick it up essentially.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's not necessarily something that is new to Playerchains, but that's part of Playerchains, which is something that has come over from peer-to-peer netcode from traditional games, which work in a similar way in a network game where just the inputs from all the players are shared. All of the participants must be playing exactly the same code, the same game, and as long as they're replicating the inputs, they replicate the state perfectly. It's all mirrored, but just by sharing inputs. And as soon as someone, so you can't cheat. You can't say, "Oh, actually, I shot you," and explode an opponent's ship, because no one else will agree with that. No one else will see that as a state. All you can do is send inputs, and all you can do is send valid inputs. So if anything gets passed around the network which isn't a valid move for a player to make, it won't be shown up. So yeah, it's anti-cheat in that sense.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So now you're changing the way we do things from a global state, to individual player chains. And I'm curious if this has any implications for game design or the types of games that we'll see come out of this. I'd actually like to start with Martin on this one because you've been exploring making a different game almost every day. So I'm curious about your experience with looking into player chains and seeing what does this imply for game development.
I would say it allows you to build the games that you would have built if there wasn't a blockchain backend. This is pretty much the conclusion that I drew, because this is what you want. This is the reason to build it. So all the constraints that you usually cater for Oh, 1 second. I don't know if you can hear this, but my dogs seem to be howling in the background. So if there's any wolf noises, that's intentional. Now it stopped. Sorry. So the fact that you get to the local state allows you to do much more interesting things. Like if you think, for example, everything that you know about NPCs and their lives in a game, you could either have this controlled by a central server, or, and this is something that's coming up big time these days, it could be autonomous agents that do their things where they actually exist. So now all of a sudden you could have this kind of design as part of a world that you are creating, and it would, in theory, it would perfectly work. And only the moment that two of those player chains collide and want to ask each other questions, this is when you need to share the state. So especially for normal interactions that you would expect that you just can't do if you need to write everything to a blockchain, you have a lot of freedom for game design, or this is at least how I understood it.
Yeah, I think there's some ideas that we really like in the fully on-chain game space. We've spent a lot of time talking about autonomous worlds, which is the idea that you can have a digital space where people are free to create whatever content that they want within the rules of that world, and it's not owned and operated by one single company. Like a really interesting set of ideas there that also recognize that what we've seen in games is the biggest thing in games in the last 10 years has been user-generated content. Roblox, Minecraft, Fortnite, all fueled by user-generated content. But can you do that in an open platform way? That's one of the things that we were trying to do with Downstream, which is a sort of primitive autonomous world. As I said, we ran into an issue where, sure, we can do those things, but it's not a great experience for players. It's certainly not at parity with Fortnite, let's say. But here with Playerchains, I think it allows us to have some of those same ideas that we learned in autonomous worlds and decentralized worlds, but instead create an experience that players have come to expect. So it allows us, I suppose, to carry on along that journey, but without compromises.
And it can still connect, as we've been discussing, to blockchain and things that are on the global public ledger, if that's at the point where that's important. And I guess that's a crucial thing. It's just designing it in or connecting to that global public blockchain state as and when necessary. So perhaps the impact on the kind of games that you wouldn't choose to use Playerchains for is really only those that are solely designed as kind of DeFi games, where you're just adding a thin gaming layer on top of some DeFi functionality. Maybe that's where Playerchains wouldn't be suited. But other than that, all the kind of games that we've been exploring, which are around fully on-chain games with permissionless composability and other decentralized affordances, then Playerchains is a good fit, whilst bringing in all of the other kind of existing genres from traditional games that you could think of.
Yeah, and Jay, I'm going to answer that question in a different way. Surprisingly, one of the problems we found in building on blockchains is that the audience that you find as a result are not the 3 billion people that play games, or at least, not the huge amount of gamers that exists in the world, but a smaller set of people that are interested in crypto. So I think as soon as you mention the B word to traditional gamers, then they'll run a mile and assume it's a scam. And the only people that do show up is people hoping to make money from your game. And I think if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have said, no, that's just, blockchain just happens to be the technology that we've been using. But I think it's actually more impactful than that. I think it's sort of crypto, unfortunately, has ended up being culturally about scams and making money and crypto bro culture. And that's really heartbreaking for me, because blockchain is just a It should just be a technology, but it isn't. It brings a lot of culture with it. So it impacts game design and gameplay because it removes itself slightly from the world of blockchain.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It seems like from your experience, Martin, as a developer, it just allows you more flexibility, faster throughput, and for you to segment and really think about your data. What needs to be globally shared? What needs to be locally distributed? So it's a lot more to think about. But once you do it the right way, it seems like your system will be faster and easier to use.
Yep.
So the next thing I want to jump into is something you briefly touched on, where you mentioned autonomous worlds, and many of our viewers may not be familiar with autonomous worlds. So if you can dig a bit into that and modding and community-driven content, and what are the opportunities here? What does that change versus, let's say, a traditional database?
Yeah, so autonomous world is the idea of a digital place. Example I always use is World of Warcraft, obviously owned and operated by Blizzard. By owning and operating, I mean they pay for the servers, they create the content, they run the economy, they police the players, all of those things. So a model that we've seen work. But an autonomous world suggests another way of running things, which is maybe closer to that Bitcoin is to a currency, where it's not controlled by any one person, but anybody can use it and participate in it. So imagine a version of World of Warcraft that isn't owned and operated by Blizzard. It has a set of rules that means that anybody can participate in that world. And importantly, people can extend it. So in the form of code, so they can add things to the game that didn't exist previously and don't have to be approved by any one centralized company. And our human world works like that. We can build whatever we want within the rules of the law, etc. And the internet is like that. That's an open world where you can build whatever you want, provided it fits with TCP/IP and DNS, etc. Then it will work. We don't exist in that world with games right now. We end up with very centrally controlled games. So autonomous worlds is the idea of, can we do a decentralized, can we do an open version of this? And that, I think, is as I said earlier, that's the most popular kind of game in the world. And I think it's the most popular form of media, right? TikTok, YouTube, etc. So I think that this allows us, autonomous world lets us do this at the next level. Analogy I sometimes use is America Online, AOL, was amazing. Like tens of thousands of people dialing up and participating in conversations. It was great. I loved it. The internet came along and like 1,000x'd it. All of a sudden, anybody could do whatever they want. They didn't need to ask permission of AOL to start a new conversation or a new news group or something. So it's easy just to imagine the status quo that, okay, we all build things in Roblox style environments, but I would posit that there's a better version that we can build using decentralized technologies. And that's sort of my definition of autonomous world.
I love I was just going to say, I love the culture. Go ahead, Martin.
Maybe one thing to add here. If you look at it from a perspective of any regular game that you see around you these days, there's very few examples that have any component that would allow the community to do anything. Even with Roblox, of course, you're allowed within the bounds of what you are allowed to build. You can be creative. You can monetize to some degree, but it really feels like same feeling that you would have if you have an app that is on the App Store, for example. It's fairly controlled. It's semi creative. Or maybe the Unity asset store. You can create an asset, you can sell it there, but only there's rules that you need to comply to. Otherwise, you always know before you even submit something, oh, this might be blocked or rejected. So you're at the grace of somebody right from the start, and you buy into this vision when you start the creative process, which can take you a lot of time and investment. Actually, if you're not investing money, you're investing time or creativity, material, whatever. So the entire thing is just a nice facade on top of how games were run forever, like owned by multinational corporations with hyper deep pockets. And if you look at something like Destiny 2 made by Bungie, they did something really, really astonishing by allowing the open source community to build the Destiny item manager, which is just a tool to manage loadouts when you fight some ginormous boss that you can't reasonably down with only one gear set. So there's this website created and owned by the community that allowed people to hook into a running instance of Destiny 2, which is a AAA that is like a solid piece of game, I would say. And still, there was a pathway into this that gave people agency to some degree. And this is like the very light form of what is possible with autonomous worlds, where you could think of the world as the running instance of this thing that never goes down, as long there is one node left to service that thing. And even if that goes down, if it comes back up, you might just have the state and keep going.
Yep.
And everything that you have in terms of logic, it's similar to something like runtime reflection. You just put code into this thing, it's getting registered, and then all of a sudden, this thing is extended by functionality, not only by assets. Assets are nice, but what if you can, I don't know, grow plants in Grand Theft Auto and sell them in a market and don't shoot anybody, but have a little flower business there. And getting to this point, this is where autonomous worlds really need to come in, or where they're coming in right now, but making this not just like a dream to come true, but fail on the technology side. This is why I think if we can get to the point that it is performant, and we have the open nature of what an autonomous world is, then this can really change the power dynamics of the entire industry.
I agree. I love the fact that you immediately jumped to selling flowers in a digital world. That tells me something about you, Martin. I like it. I was going to use the example of Eve, so I think they've said enough about it publicly. But to me, this is a really interesting project. Of course, Eve is a space MMO that's been going for 20 years. They're really masters of building a universe that they're very hands-off with, but is a game that hundreds of thousands of people love. Their next version of Eve, called Eve Frontier, and the current version of Eve, I should explain, allows community to create add-ons, but those add-ons are read-only, i.e. they can just read the state of the world and can tell you what's going on. The next version of Eve, which is almost a fully on-chain game, I don't know if they call it an autonomous world, but importantly has the attribute where those community mods can now write into the world. It's actually, you can create code that connects to the code of Eve Frontier, and therefore you can create new things that exist within that world. And that, I think, is taking modding to a different level. This is not modding where you, as you know, if you download this add-on, then you can see a new aspect of the game. This is adding something to the game that everybody sees immediately. You go into this point in space and there's something new going on that wasn't there a week ago, not because CCP, the makers of Eve, have made it, but because the community have decided that would be a fun thing to put in that point. That to me is a really exciting form of maybe the next generation of user-generated content.
So it allows us to openly create. And Martin and I have been talking about community-driven games and trying to see if we can build a game with the community. It seems like autonomous worlds, maybe Playerchains is the route, because they can build their own interfaces to interact with our data, things like that.
Yeah, I think that to be clear, you could build a similar system using centralized systems. I think that the advantage of using decentralized systems like blockchains or Playerchain is that you can provably build a system that doesn't rely on a centralized party with admin oversight over that world. And I think that's a more interesting thing to build. I think for instance, Bitcoin would be less interesting if there was a Bitcoin Limited that could choose to use its admin powers to issue another 5 million Bitcoins, right? It ends up being something different. So at some level, it doesn't sound important, but I think fundamentally the fact that you use decentralized system and you have a godless game creates something different.
Yeah, in many ways, when I talk to people about it and I try to explain it, I almost think of it as like APIs that don't rate limit you and that you can like freely access without you talking to someone.
Yeah,
that's the way I view it.
To be clear, there's a bunch of challenges in doing that. Like, how do you allow people to do that without fundamentally breaking the game? You know, can I as a modder create something that breaks the game for everybody or imbalances the game? So it opens up a new set of possibilities, but it also introduces a new set of challenges.
And I think it's a cat and mouse game with the community. Someone builds something that's like destructive. Everyone else builds like a counter mechanic or something like that together to balance the game out again.
Yeah, and when I'm feeling optimistic about this, then I would say that that's feature, not bug. The idea of a cat and mouse game that's going on between new ideas that are happening in the world. The human world we live in has all sorts of innovations that happen that change the way society is, but that's a feature of being human in the world, I'd say, rather than a bug that we'd look to stamp out.
Yeah, and if it's done really well, it can add to the lore, to the story, and like
Absolutely.
how the communities and the stories unraveling.
Yep.
Cool. So for anyone who's interested and they want to look into Playerchains, they want to get started, what advice do you have for developers looking to build with Playerchains?
I think the first thing is, before even looking at Playerchains, I would say, think about what do you care about? What are you trying to build? What do you care about? And then be critical about what piece of technology are you using for the job? Because I think that we'll hit a local maxima just by taking blockchains and assuming that's the only tool that's available. And like Playerchains is our implementation of an idea that is simply making the players nodes on a blockchain. And you can use our implementation, it's open source and it's free, or you can just think about it yourself and think about what would be your approach. There's other teams that are using a sort of CRDT approach. We're using a DAG consensus, which cares about ordering. But I mean, I guess the first thing, as I say, would be for people to consider what is the right tool for the job. And if they're interested in knowing more about Playerchains, then we really run an open book here where, as I say, everything's open source in our GitHub repository. And more than that, we're just happy to talk about that. So contact me on Telegram. 10 Trucks is my Telegram name. And it's a topic of interest, and we like people that are willing to think differently about how to approach these kind of problems, which is, as I said at the start of the podcast, what I liked about when we first started talking to Martin.
I'm curious, Ian, do you have any advice for developers?
I think it depends what the developer's background is, and I can imagine like two routes to Playerchains. One is coming from Web3 blockchain programming perspective, and the other is maybe coming from traditional game development. And because it's kind of a fusion of the two, if you're developing with Playerchains. And so maybe from the traditional games perspective, if a game developer is interested in ideas like autonomous worlds, decentralization in general, or even just running their games without servers and backends, they might be interested in looking at Playerchains. And it's really building on a tradition that's a couple of decades old now of peer-to-peer multiplayer using deterministic simulation, which I've used in the past before moving into Web3 for multiplayer games. And I would say that in general is a really great model to look at for games in general. You end up, compared to the multiplayer architecture of server and client, which is passing state around, there's lots of cool things that happen when you have a deterministic logic which operates perfectly on everyone's machines when you're just passing inputs around, some of which are the lower latency effect of the network, but there's other cool things that happen, like your render code gets separated nicely from your game logic, and you end up with a much more testable and maintainable code base. So I don't know if that's a good way to start looking at Playerchains, but there's like some extra motivations as to why contractors might want to.
Can I add to that, which is that, this call, I think, is focused mostly from the blockchain side, the Web3 side. I think it's really interesting to consider that if you're making a traditional game and you're saying, how am I going to handle multiplayer? When Ian and I have built those in the past, then it's usually server authoritative. You have to rent a server from Amazon and you have to build a bunch of server code. Playerchains represents an alternative, which is that you don't need to have a server at all. So it's free, plus you don't have to build any code. You're just using Playerchains to create a serverless multiplayer game. And I think that's, not only is it interesting maybe from a cost-saving point of view or in terms of implementation point of view, but now, depending on how much you care about decentralization and players being able to run themselves self-serve, then I think it represents a good choice for all those reasons.
Nice. So in my mind, as you were saying that, I thought if I'm building a multiplayer game, I need to document everything that's happening between these players. This is probably the go-to choice versus a global state where I don't necessarily need to share all that information.
I think it depends on the game, truthfully, but I think it's suitable for probably the majority of games. It's probably the right choice for if you're trying to approach decentralization in games. It's probably the correct approach for most games. It's certainly worth considering, particularly if you're creating a game and you're thinking about how you're going to approach server architecture, how you're handling synchronous multiplayer, then I think this is a good option.
And maybe from the pure chain safe perspective, if you manage to grow your game to enough player chain nodes at some point, you will have a much more robust system that is not so at risk of either being like attacked, DDoSed, taken down for economic reasons, muted in some jurisdiction that does not like, I don't know, games about flowers, and all sorts of things that could happen to your game that you don't want. And now we're talking about this. I am currently developing a game with a standard client-server architecture. And right before this call, I was furious about a couple of things that were happening on my terminal that I've seen so often before. And don't get me wrong, if I implement Playerchains there, I will probably see other kind of network errors that I've never faced before, which is always the case. But at least it would be, from my perspective, it would be worth the pain, because I will have to endure weird network behavior anyways. And if I'm just feeding my energy into something that will inherently be run by somebody with some incentive to keep the service up and running, that is not aligned with what I want to do, just providing a game to people to play, then it might become the riskier choice. And this is probably the moment in time where developers, like the tipping point where people then just say, okay, maybe we need to do it better. Similar to, I don't know, if you have organic fruit in the store and it's very, very expensive, nobody buys this, but everybody knows it's actually the right thing to do. When you get it to the point where everybody can afford it, or it even gets cheaper than the other stuff, then everybody moves in this direction. I think it just needs a bit of time to really think about what you want to do with your game, and maybe a bit of a shift in the developer's mindset in general. That it might not be the most smart idea to just dance when some huge publisher wants that, and focus on your own strength, and then make it robust so that it can outlive your initial creation and become something bigger.
It's a bit, it reminds me a little bit of torrents that sort of exist for as long as people care about them. I think that's good. I'm not really one for hyperbole, but But I think you can kind of think of Playerchains as your games layer one, where all the players end up creating a chain amongst. So every game every game that you publish ends up having its own chain automatically, which is made up of all the people playing the game. And I think that is a more interesting approach than say, let's use this one blockchain for everybody's game. I think it's more interesting to say, why don't we create a chain for every game, just in the background, using the players, not using nodes that need to be paid for. So yeah, different approach, worthy of some thought.
Yeah, definitely. Ever since I met you, I've been thinking about it too, all the different implications. And like I mentioned earlier, it just makes sense to me now that I'm aware of it. So I'd love to like tinker around with your tech and see how to actually build something myself. Now, we're coming to the end of the hour. So how can the audience stay up to date with you? And are there any last messages for the viewer? Let's start over with Ian, then go to David, and then Martin.
Sure. Yeah. So as David says, we're building out in the open, and at the moment we've built the space shooter demo, which runs our player chain tech. And so the best place to start looking at that is our GitHub. So at github.com/Playmint, and we have a player chain demo repository there, and that's a good launching point to see all the other documentation around how player chains are working. And yeah, we'd love anyone who was having a look, either get in touch. They could fork it and start building their own, or they could even raise some issues with what they see there and start building that with us. It's an open source project.
Awesome. Visit the GitHub.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, I'll add by saying that there's playmint.com, which has links to not only the source code, but some of our thinking about why we've made the choices that we have. I would expand that to say, I'm seeing a bit of groundswell of teams that are looking for approaches that don't exclusively use blockchain. And whether that's moving computation off-chain in using ZK proofs or using CRDTs or DAG consensus, but like I'm seeing like maybe 10 teams that are exploring that idea. If come and join us, contact us and we'll show you that world. It seems to me that there's a bit of a groundswell of teams looking to take a different approach, and I'd love to talk to people that are at least interested in the same ideas.
Awesome. So definitely reach out, look into Playmint. Martin?
For me, it's quite easy because I'm on the receiving end of that repository, where I can just grab it and make it work, overcome my current pain with client-server architecture, and see how that comes. Like, the gameplay is not that fast, but it's a 3D world, and the update cycle runs so and so often per second. So I might want to give it a good swing over Christmas. Christmas is always a great time to try new technologies out, and I will do that and report back with whatever I find. Maybe I can raise an issue or maybe even provide a fix. We will see. So this is my plan for the Christmas holiday.
Love it.
Perfect.
Awesome. Definitely keep me up to date with what you're working on, Martin. I'd love to explore Playerchains as well. And as I mentioned, I teach courses to different game developers. So it'd be cool for us to wrap our heads around this and be able to share with others.
Thank you.
Well, with that said, I want to thank you all for coming onto the stage. Thank you, David. Thank you, Ian, for taking some time for just meeting me at the event, saying hi to me, because it led to a lot of different conversations and to this stream. So thank you for coming on the stream today.
Good to be here. Thanks for your time, Jay.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Martin.
Thanks. I hope everyone has a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So thank you all for joining our stream today. If you want to keep up with ChainSafe, join our Discord, follow our Twitter, and stay tuned for an upcoming event we have in about 2 weeks over in Art Game Jam.